What would you do if the only roof over your head was one you weren't supposed to find? The night Caleb Merritt turned 22, he didn't have a cake. He didn't have a phone with anyone's number left to call. What he had was a duffel bag with a broken zipper, $43 in crumpled bills, and a truck that had died on the side of Route 9 outside of Harwick, Vermont, in the middle of the worst November storm in 11 years. The kind of storm that doesn't just fall, it presses. It leans against you like it has somewhere to be and you're in the way. He'd been driving since 4 in the morning, heading nowhere in particular, which is exactly where you end up when nowhere in particular is the only place left. 3 weeks earlier, his mother, Sandra Merritt, had died in her sleep in the small house on Birchwood Lane, where Caleb had grown up. She was 58. The doctors called it cardiac arrest. Caleb called it what it was. A woman who had worked herself down to the bone for 30 years and never once asked anyone for anything, finally running out of time before the world got around to being kind to her. The house wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs. It belonged to a landlord named Ray Dalton, who had been patient in the way that people are patient when they know they're going to collect eventually. Sandra had been 2 months behind. Caleb, who had been working at a supply warehouse outside Burlington, found that out the same day he found the eviction notice tucked under the door, dated 2 days before she died. He didn't know if she had seen it. He hoped she hadn't. Ray Dalton gave him a week to clear the place out. Caleb used 4 days. He put what mattered into the duffel bag, sold the rest for $112 and drove. And now the truck was dead, and the storm was not, and the temperature was dropping the way it does in Vermont in November, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a light going out. He sat in the cab for 20 minutes, telling himself someone would come. No one came. The road was empty in both directions, the kind of empty that feels intentional. He pulled on his second jacket over his first, zipped the duffel, and got out. The wind hit him like something with a grudge. He walked along the road's edge with his head down, his boots punching through the thin crust of ice that had formed over the snow. There was nothing out here, no houses, no lights, no signs of anything that had ever been warm. Just trees, and more trees, and the sound of the storm talking to itself in the dark. He'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when he almost missed it entirely. It was the fence post that saved him. One of those old iron ones, half swallowed by a wild hedge, with a length of rusted chain hanging off it. He grabbed it instinctively to keep from sliding down a slope he hadn't seen coming, and when he caught his balance and looked up, he saw it, a structure, low to the ground, half buried in the hillside itself, the way old things sometimes are when the land just slowly takes them back. The roof was white with snow, and the windows, what he could see of them, were dark, but it was solid. The walls were still standing, and there was a door. He pushed through the hedge, slid down the slope on the seat of his jeans, and stood in front of it, a lighthouse keeper's outpost. That's what the small bronze plate beside the door read, though the words were so weathered he had to press his face close to make them out. Harwick Point Auxiliary Station. Est, 1931. Below that, almost entirely eaten by rust. Property of the U.S. Lighthouse Service. He tried the handle. It didn't move. He tried again, harder, putting his shoulder into it, and something inside the door, some old bolt frozen with decades of cold and disuse, gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and the door swung inward and nearly took him with it. The smell hit him first. Dust and iron and something faintly woody, like old rope. Then the cold, which was different from the cold outside. Stiller, quieter, the cold of a room that had been sealed for a very long time. He found a wall with his hand and felt along it until his fingers hit the edge of a shelf, and on that shelf 3 things. A box of wooden matches, a candle stub about 4 inches tall, and a tin cup that rattled when he touched it. He lit the candle. The room came up slowly, the way things do by candlelight, shapes before details, outlines before edges. It was one room, maybe 16 feet by 12, with a low ceiling and walls made of heavy timber that had gone almost black with age. There was a cot against one wall with a canvas cover folded on it, a small iron stove in the corner, cold but intact, a wooden chair. A table with a drawer that stuck halfway and wouldn't come further, a set of metal shelves along the back wall with half a dozen rusted tins, and what looked like a kerosene lantern missing its globe. He got the stove going with a chunk of the split wood stacked beside it. Someone, at some point, had left enough for a few days, and sat in the chair with his hands flat against the iron sides as it warmed. He didn't think about anything for a while. He just let himself be warm. He was almost asleep in the chair when he noticed the floor. It was the stove's light that caught it, the way a low orange light finds angles that daylight misses. There was a seam in the floorboards near the base of the back wall that was too clean to be accidental. A rectangle, roughly 2 feet by 3, with a small recessed iron ring at one end that had been painted over so many times it had nearly disappeared into the wood. Caleb crouched down. He dug his thumbnail under the ring, worked it loose, and pulled. The hatch came up with a groan that filled the room. Below it was a space at about 18 inches deep. Not quite a cellar, more like a deliberate pocket in the foundation. And sitting in that space, wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied with a length of waxed cord, was a metal box roughly the size of a shoebox. He lifted it out and set it on the table. The cord came loose easily. The oilcloth had done its job. Whatever was inside was dry. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a logbook, navy blue cover, stamped with the seal of the U.S. Lighthouse service. He opened it and found entries dating from 1931 to 1948, the handwriting changing once midway through, from a firm, slanted script to something smaller and more careful, as though whoever took over was conscious of not wasting space. The entries were routine, weather conditions, lamp maintenance, supply inventories, but at the back of the logbook, on a page that had been folded in half and tucked into the back cover, someone had written something that was not routine at all. It was undated. The handwriting was the second one, the careful small kind. If you are reading this, you found your way in. That means the storm drove you here or curiosity did, and either one is a good enough reason. This station belonged to my father and then to me. I kept the light for 19 years after he couldn't anymore. The service was decommissioned in 1962, and they took the lamp and left everything else, which is their right, I suppose. I stayed in Harwick another 30 years after that. I have no children. I have a nephew, but he is not the kind of man his father was, and I made my arrangements accordingly. What this station holds in trust. Not for the government. Not for the count, for whoever needs it most and has sense enough to use it well. The second item in this box will explain the rest. Augustine Vane, 1991. The second item was a manila envelope, sealed with wax that had cracked but held. Inside it was a document. 3 pages, handwritten, witnessed by 2 signatures at the bottom of the last page. It took Caleb 2 full readings to understand what he was looking at. It was a deed. A hand-drawn deed, not a legal instrument in any modern sense, but what Augustine Vane had clearly believed was a moral one. It conveyed the Lighthouse station and the land immediately surrounding it. 4 acres, by the description, to any person of good character who shelters here in genuine need, provided they remain and restore or ensure the station's continued use for the benefit of others in similar circumstances. The third item was a key. Brass, old-fashioned, with a tag attached to it by a thin wire. Written on the tag in that same careful hand, Harwick Registry of Deeds. Box 114. Caleb sat with all 3 items spread in front of him on the table for a long time. Outside, the storm was still going. Inside, the stove ticked. He was 22 years old. He had $43 and a broken duffel bag and a dead truck on Route 9. He had buried his mother 17 days ago in a cemetery in Burlington because it was the cheapest option and she had no preference left to express. He folded everything carefully, put it back in the metal box, and set the box on the shelf above the cot. Then he lay down on the canvas cover, still in both jackets, and slept harder than he had slept since before she died. He woke to silence. The storm had passed. Through the single window, a pale winter light came in at a low angle, the kind of light that only exists in early morning in November, clean and cold and without opinion. He could see the window properly now. Small, square, thick glass, the kind they used to make before they knew how to make it any other way. It was intact. The stove had gone out, but the room held enough warmth that he wasn't shaking. He pulled on his boots, went outside, and looked at what daylight showed him. The station sat at the edge of a bluff overlooking what had been, a long time ago, a working harbor. The harbor was still there, but the working part wasn't. The docks had rotted to their pilings, and the 2 remaining buildings along the waterfront were boarded. But the bluff was solid. The land around the station was real. 4 acres, if Augustine Vane had measured correctly, which Caleb had a feeling he had. He walked the property in the cold. He stood at the edge of the bluff for a while and looked at the water. Then he walked back into the station, picked up the metal box, and drove. Once he'd gotten the truck towed and the fuel line sorted, which cost him $31 of his $43, to the Harwick County Courthouse. The clerk at the Registry of Deeds was a woman named Lorene Ashby, who had worked in that office for 26 years and had the kind of face that has heard everything and is neither impressed nor dismissive. She looked at the key Caleb set on the counter. She looked at him. She looked at the key again. Box 114 hasn't been accessed since 1991, she said. I know, Caleb said. She brought him to the back room and watched while he opened it. Inside the box was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a legal document, this one typed, properly witnessed, and notarized, that Augustine Vane had filed in November of 1991, 6 months before he died. It was a trust instrument, drawn up by a Harwick attorney named Godfrey Lorene told him had passed away in 2003. The trust held the deed to the Lighthouse station and the surrounding land in a conditional grant, the conditions of which matched exactly what the handwritten document in the metal box had said. Lorene read it twice. Then she made a copy and had it logged. This is real, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what it looks like, Caleb said. She gave him the contact information for the county's property authority and told him to get himself a lawyer. He thanked her and left. What happened next was not fast, and it was not simple, and there were 3 months in the middle of it when Caleb genuinely did not know which way it was going to go. The complication was a man named Sterling Croft, 54, who was the nephew Augustine Vane had referred to in his note, the one he'd described as not being the kind of man his father was. Sterling had spent the better part of 2 decades waiting for the property to revert, operating on the assumption that any trust without a clear beneficiary would eventually dissolve. He had a lawyer, a man named Philip Oakes, who wore good suits and said things like, "The original instrument was never properly recorded," in a tone that implied recording was everything, and character was nothing. Sterling's claim was that the conditional grant was unenforceable, that the language was too vague, the condition too subjective, and that, as the only surviving family member, he was the rightful heir to whatever Augustine had left. Caleb's lawyer was a woman named Agnes Thurlow, 61, who had a small practice in Burlington and who took the case on reduced fees after reading the trust document and the handwritten note and sitting quietly for a moment. She said Mr. Vane went to considerable effort to make his wishes known. That tends to matter. She was right. It took time, and it took a circuit court judge named Harlan Briggs, who read every word of the original 1991 filing and the handwritten logbook entry and the deed copy that Lorene Ashby had certified. It took 3 hearings and 1 postponement and a lot of waiting in hallways. In the 3rd hearing, Philip Oakes made the argument that Caleb had produced no evidence of genuine need, that he was a young man who could work, who had options, who had chosen to shelter in the station rather than being compelled by necessity. Agnes didn't raise her voice. She laid out in calm and exact language what the record showed, the eviction notice, the truck repair that had taken almost everything he had, the temperature that night, 16 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping, the fact that Caleb had not known what was in that hidden compartment when he broke down the door. He had come in out of the cold, that's all. That was the whole story. Judge Briggs looked at Sterling Croft. He looked at Philip Oakes. He looked at the document Augustine Vane had taken the trouble to file with the county 34 years ago. Mr. Vane was clear, Briggs said. The court is not inclined to be less so. Sterling Croft stood up so fast his chair scraped. This is outrageous, he said. My uncle spent his whole life building that. Sit down, Mr. Croft, Briggs said. Sterling sat. His face had gone the color of old brick. The judgment took 11 more days to be entered. When it was, Caleb drove back to Harwick in February, in weather that had turned sharp and bright, the kind of cold that has no moisture in it, just edge. He parked on the bluff, sat on the hood of his truck, and looked at the station for a long time. The harbor below was still quiet. The docks were still rotted. The boarded buildings were still boarded. He thought about his mother, Sandra, who had spent her whole adult life in other people's houses, paying rent on things she could never own, working jobs that didn't care what her name was as long as she showed up on time, who had, in the last months of her life, mentioned once, only once, that if she'd had her way, she would have liked to live near water. He had been 20 and not listening well enough, and he'd said, "Yeah, maybe someday," and she had nodded and gone back to whatever she was doing, and that had been that. He got off the hood of the truck. He walked down to the station, unlocked the door with the old brass key, and went inside. He spent the first week cleaning. The second week he drove to Burlington and talked to a contractor named Ben Sowell, who had done restoration work on historic buildings, and who walked through the station with a flashlight and a clipboard and said, "At the end of it, bones are good." This thing was built to last. The framing was Douglas fir, old growth, and it had not moved. The roof had needed work. The plumbing, what there was of it, needed to be replaced entirely. The electrical had never been run at all, which meant starting from scratch, which was, Ben said, actually easier than trying to salvage someone else's old work. Caleb applied for a historic preservation grant through the state. It was the first time he had ever applied for anything official, and he did it with Agnes Thurlow's help, and it was accepted 4 months later. He also applied for a permit to open what he described, in the application, as a transitional shelter and resource center for individuals experiencing housing instability, with a focus on individuals under 30 and over 55. The two groups, he wrote in the application narrative, that data consistently showed were most vulnerable to long-term housing loss and least served by existing infrastructure. He named it the Sandra Merritt Station. The permit process took longer than the grant. There were zoning hearings and neighbor comments, and a meeting with the Harwick Select Board that ran 2.5 hours and ended with a vote of 4-1 in favor. The one against was a man named Douglas Fenn, who said that a shelter would change the character of the neighborhood, by which he meant the bluff, by which he meant the view. The Select Board chair, a woman named Adele Krause, who had lived in Harwick for 40 years and had a way of ending discussions by simply looking at the person who needed to stop talking, said, "The character of this community is that we take care of people. I'd like to keep it that way." Douglas Fenn did not say anything else. Ben Sowell finished the restoration in 14 months, on a Thursday morning in late September, with the harbor below flat and silver in the early light. Caleb unlocked the front door of the Sandra Merritt Station for the first time. There were 8 rooms inside now, 6 for residents, 1 common room, 1 office. There were 2 people scheduled to move in the following Monday, a 60-year-old man named Walter, who had been living in his car in Burlington for 4 months, and a 19-year-old from St. Johnsbury named Deanna, who had aged out of foster care in June and had been couch surfing since. He stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The brass key was in his jacket pocket. He had worn a groove in it over the past year from taking it out and turning it over in his hand. The way you do with something you need to keep reminding yourself is real. He thought about the night he had pushed through the hedge and slid down that slope and stood in front of a door he had no right to open, except the right of being cold and having nowhere else to go. He thought about Augustine Vane, who had kept a light burning for 19 years and then spent the next 30 years figuring out how to keep it burning after he was gone. He thought about his mother, who had loved water and never got to live near it. The station faced east. In the mornings, the sun came over the water and hit the front windows at an angle that made the old glass glow amber, the way stained glass does, like something lit from inside. He had left that window exactly as it was. If you've ever felt like the world just moved on without you, like you did everything right and still ended up with nothing to show for it, then you know what Caleb felt that night on Route 9. Sometimes all we need is one door that opens when everything else is locked. And sometimes the only way to honor that is to make sure the door stays open for the next person. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, people who found something worth holding on to when they had nothing left, you know where to find us.